Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this professional development learning opportunity. Excuse me. I am Jessica Roberts, Business Relationship Manager with NCEA, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Within 24 hours of the completion of today's webinar, you'll receive an email with the recording and additional show notes. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out via the Zoom email that you received after registering. Just a few housekeeping notes as people are joining. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A window. There will also be a Q&A session at the end of this webinar to answer any questions you might have. We will monitor and try to make sure that all of them are answered in our allotted time. Additionally, at the end of this session, I'll share a link to the online survey and how to receive a certificate of completion for the webinar. Today's webinar, The Science of Reading for Leaders, Helping Your Teachers Shift Instructional Practice, is brought to you by NCEA's Platinum Partner, NWEA. Our speakers today are literacy experts Beth, Praska, and Luke Bell. Before I turn it over to our presenters, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord our God, in your wisdom and love, you surround us with the mysteries of the universe. Send your spirit upon these students, upon our students, and fill them with your wisdom and blessings. Grant that they may devote themselves to their studies and draw you ever closer to you, the source of all knowledge. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Thank you, Beth and Luke, for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Luke to get us started.
Absolutely. And is that poll live, Jessica?
That poll is live. So as of right now, you have about 50% site administrators, 6% district administrators. Teachers is at about 38%, and other is 6%.
Well, once again, thank you all for being here with us today. My name is Luke Bell, and I lead our work for the literacy-focused instructional professional learning. So we're really focused on how do we help teachers shift practice, and excited to be here with you today. So as we were discussing, we're aiming for about 45 minutes of content, leaving room for Q&A at the end. Make sure that if you have those questions, use the Q&A function or the chat box. This will be recorded, and there will be a short survey at the end. I'm just one of our co-hosts, and so I want to offer Dr. Beth Praska the opportunity to come on and introduce herself.
Thank you for having me. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to work with all of you today. As just a little bit of footnote, I started my education career as a teacher in a Catholic school in Ramsey, New Jersey. So shout out to anybody in New Jersey. I lived there. We lived in New York for about 4 years. So I'm not from the East Coast. I'm actually from Minnesota. So we returned back to Minnesota. So you might hear a little bit of that O sound that us from Minnesota like to make. And I'm happy to be here. I have a lot of experience in education, and I have been where you are as a teacher. I've also been a building leader and a district leader. I'm currently on a school board, so that's a little bit different path to support schools. And as I went through and got my doctorate in administration and literacy, I enjoy the opportunities to reach out and interact with people that are still in the field as I support leaders and teachers across the country. So thank you for having me join you, Luke.
No problem. And as Beth said, we work together closely at NWEA and HMH to make sure that we support teachers and leaders across our states and our partners with high quality professional learning that's engaging, that's practical, and something that helps folks translate the research into practice. So before I joined NWEA, I worked in schools and districts and also as a consultant for some other curricular providers. And so my focus is really on how can we engage teachers, leaders, and policymakers in conversations about what is the future of equitable and excellent education for all kids. And so one of the questions I want us to start with is why literacy? Why now? For me, I think about our school stories. And so from our earliest moments in school, we began crafting these stories about our learning. And some of my earliest learning and school stories have to do with my experience learning to read. And so more than anything, I remember tears at the kitchen table crying with my mom, trying to memorize this long, long list of words. But thankfully, that's not where my school story stopped. Ultimately, I had my favorite books. I had these stories that I loved to tell, and I really enjoyed reading and writing good stories. But I also remember my experience watching my sister learn to read. And she had an early diagnosis of dyslexia with a specific learning disability in reading. And my sister's experience was frustrating, to say the least. She largely had access to those same types of reading instruction that I had, meaning that she didn't always get what she needed. Those opportunities to learn were not always there. But with the support of some strong folks in special education and intervention, as she would tell it, by middle school, my sister was a strong reader. She considered herself to be a good reader and still loves reading today, no matter how effortful it still is. But I want to include that our school stories are bigger than our own experiences in school. The photo you see on the far right, that's my papa. And my papa's school story ended in 6th grade when he started farming full-time with his family to make ends meet. My papa largely achieved reading fluency as an adult with the help of newspapers, trader papers, and his Bible. And similarly, my granny's school story, it cut short in 8th grade. Years later, she did earn her high school diploma alongside 2 of her children and her sister. And so I start with this today because I want to think about our own school stories. And so as you listen and as you participate today, think about your school story. What do you remember about your experience learning to read? Because when we think about the stories that shape our states, our schools, and our students, literacy is at the center of the story. Many Americans share a similar story to the chapters in my own family's book. Their struggle for literacy extends past school and well into their adult lives. And so when I think about the 52 million people represented here, I wonder what their stories might tell us about their experience learning to read. What might 1 in 6 adults have to say about literacy? And what might it look like for our teachers, schools, and districts to change the narrative? We're here today to think about how we can support teachers with shifting instructional practice. When I think about how we change our collective literacy narrative, I think it starts with moving from advocacy to action with the science of reading. And so like many here, I am sure that your inbox, your social feeds, and all your teacher friends, we're talking about the science of reading. We've read the stories about the flawed ideas, the rise and fall of some programs, and the push for early literacy instruction to be aligned with the science. But what seems to get lost in these stories is the weight of the science of reading. Because with all of these calls for change in instruction, this can be a very heavy conversation for our teachers and for our schools. One of the things that we know is that to date, more than 30 states have passed new legislation based on the science of reading, focusing on 6 categories, including teacher preparation, teacher certification, license renewal, professional development, coaching, assessment, materials, instruction, or intervention. In 2021, 13 states initiated this policy push in more than one categories. 6 states joined in 2022, and many more have legislation passing and going through the process right now in 2023. All of this to say that policymakers are working to change the stories our states can tell about literacy. And in the same way, many of our teacher prep programs are responding. Each year since 2013, the National Council on Teacher Quality has reviewed our teacher prep program specifically for how well they systematically and explicitly teach the 5 essential components of effective reading instruction. This organization reviews the syllabi. They look at all required courses and all required textbooks for our new teachers. And one of the things I want you to do is take a moment to look at that first component, phonemic awareness. And what do you notice? In the past decade, this review has found change from 35% of prep programs training teachers in phonemic awareness instruction to 51% of programs providing that essential training. While change is coming, as you can see, we still have a long way to go because unfortunately, too many teachers can tell a story about how their experience in a prep program did not equip them with the experience, the knowledge, the skills necessary to teach every child how to read. Many of those folks have joined together and created their own community in places like the Science of Reading for Leaders. Science of Reading, what I should have learned in college, with more than 200,000 members. These teachers, not unlike many maybe on this call, they have their own challenges dealing with the blame, the unlearning, and the intense personal and professional growth responding to the needs of our kids. And that's why we have to change the conversation from shame to support as we lighten the load of the science of reading. And as we think about this story that we play in our student stories, I want you to think about if we were to write an honest letter to parents about our teaching, about our schools, or about our district, what might the story sound like? Might it sound like this letter Dr. Pamela Snow, professor of cognitive psychology, shared as a cautionary tale? I wonder what our stories might be if we don't embrace the best of the science of reading and ground our teaching in what works and what matters, because I don't think anyone here wants a story to be told that sounds quite like this. And while that parent letter might be a cautionary tale, when we look at our nationwide results, it's clear that we have a responsibility to act. Why literacy? Why now? According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, 37% of fourth grade students performed in the basic level in 2022, only 4 percentage points higher than 2019, and not significantly different from 1992. Unfortunately, the story doesn't change much by eighth grade. Nationally, 30% of eighth grade students perform below basic in 2022 and 3 percentage points higher than 2019. And again, not significantly different from 1992. This means that 30 years later, our national report card signals there's been no significant change in reading outcomes. Millions of students in the United States are still struggling to learn how to read. And so I want to ask you here, what do you think the story here is in the scores? And so as we think about all of those different factors that come into this conversation as leaders, let's think about responsibility. Learning Forward, a leading professional learning organization, argues that educators have a professional, ethical responsibility to improve throughout their careers. I think many of us share that belief, and that's why we're here. We've got our pen and paper and our coffee, and we're ready to talk about the change necessary. We believe in our own need for improvement, and no matter the kind of week we had last week or the wild stories we could tell about how the school year ended, we are here together learning. We're here because we believe every child has a story to tell. We're here because we believe every child can learn to read. And we're here because we believe every child deserves access to an equitable and excellent education. So I want to turn it back to Beth, and let's talk about the science.
Thank you, Luke. So let's start out with, well, what is the science of reading? The science of reading is the converging evidence of what matters and what works in literacy instruction. It's organized around models that describe the how and the why. I want to repeat that converging evidence. The science of reading is not just one research study. It's many research studies, thousands of research studies that have converged together over the last decade or two, many decades actually. I forget how old I am. It's been around for many decades. And it's coming together and illuminating the best instruction to meet our students' needs. So let's start with a model of, well, what matters to learn to read and why, and break it down into the aspects of, well, how do students learn to read? So that brings us to the simple view of reading. I like simple. Life is complicated enough. Let's stay with simple. But it's really not simple. That's just the title of this framework. Reading comprehension involves two aspects of how do students learn to read. The decoding part. You might also see the formula with decoding as WR for word reading. Basically, that means are students able to lift print off the page and sound out the words? And then beyond sounding out, do they just read the words? Eventually, they will become, and then move into sentence reading. So they're decoding the words. They're breaking down the pattern. They're learning to break the code. They're decoding printed word. The other side is language comprehension. That's the part about, do you understand the words? Can you comprehend the meaning of them? I want to tell a little story about how these go together. And sometimes there's one side that's weak and one side that's strong, or maybe both sides are weak. But I have a personal story about a weakness in the language comprehension side. This was a while ago because my children certainly are old enough that I don't read aloud to them anymore. But one time when my oldest son was in high school, he had an injury he was recuperating from. And so he asked me to read his physics textbook aloud to him. I thought, sure, I can do that. I read about 5 pages out of the textbook to him. And at the end, I said, well, I sure hope you know what that meant, because I did not understand a single word of it. Now, this is coming from someone with a doctorate in education. Obviously, my doctorate is not in physics. I was able to decode the text. I was proficient in that part, but I was not proficient in the language comprehension side. I did not have the background knowledge nor the vocabulary acquisition to help me fully comprehend the text. Now, I am a literacy expert, but I know enough about math that if it's an equation involving multiplication, if one side is a 0 or weak, that's going to weaken the other side. So the simple view of reading clearly demonstrates that students need to be proficient in decoding and language comprehension to move towards full reading comprehension, which is the end goal. We always want students to comprehend what they read, but along the way, we're supporting the decoding and the language comprehension based on what the student needs. So thinking about that, let's look at another model that explains reading. This one is called the Cognitive Foundations Framework. And you'll note that it is Toomer, who also worked with us on the Simple Mood reading, is one of the founders of this model. He brought in his graduate student, Hoover, and they put together the Cognitive Foundations Framework. And I really like this framework because I'm a visual person, and it demonstrates the aspects of the building blocks. So you still have reading comprehension. Our end goal, we're always concerned about reading comprehension. But we then can see, well, what parts support reading comprehension? We still have word recognition or decoding, that's still there. And we also still have language comprehension, that's still there. But let's go deeper, more granular. What aspects of, or what building blocks do students need from instruction to support that? I like to take a little bit of a step back and think about how students learn to read and what goes on in the brain. We know that students are able to understand language and produce language from the early onset of life. They start to talk, around 2, but before that, they're taking in language. The brain is born, your students are born with a brain, or children are born with a brain that can, most of them are able to bring in language and understand the purpose of language and communicate. It still needs to be taught explicitly as far as the vocabulary and that robust instruction that brings them through the understanding the semantics of the language and syntax and providing background knowledge. But the word recognition side, the decoding side, is not intuitive brain. And we have to explicitly instruct students how to break the code. So looking at the cognitive foundations allows us to dig deeper into the granular part of what needs to occur for students to move towards reading comprehension. So I walked through some of the steps in language comprehension, and that's the aspect we're always supporting students towards that linguistic knowledge and breaking down the aspects of the language and working on background knowledge that supports the vocabulary, which is really important as students progress through grades. And think about my lack of vocabulary to support my physics understanding, right? Was a detriment to my understanding of that text. So we're constantly building that language and providing an opportunity for students to have access to vocabulary that continually grows to meet the needs and the demands of the grade level text. Now looking over to word recognition, that it's sequential and it's systematic and explicitly taught with our youngest students, phonemic awareness and building on letter knowledge. What sounds correspond with what letters? We're instructing them in that, which then helps them with the alphabetic principle. And all along, we're teaching concepts of print. Where do you start in a text? How do you open a book? How does it all fit together? Which then feeds up to breaking that code with the alphabetic coding skill. So both of those go together and support reading comprehension. This is a lot to ask for teachers and building administrators. And I'm not asking you to become proficient in the understanding the research, but I think understanding the granular aspects of how students learn to read will support instruction. And that's why I love this graphic, because it breaks it down. I always think of it as the game Jenga, right? You build your tower and then you slowly start taking blocks away. Well, what happens if you remove enough blocks? The tower falls over. So the cognitive foundations is very similar. If a student is struggling in phonemic awareness or letter knowledge, that foundation of the tower is going to be a little bit unstable. And that's where instruction comes into play. So let's move on to thinking about, well, that's a lot of research. I just shared with you a lot of research. So I'm kind of a research geek, and I know all of you out there aren't. So I want to let you know that you don't have to dig into all of the different aspects of research like I have chosen to do. There are documents and resources out there that converge all of the research together. So I would encourage you, if you have not already, to dig into the IES research, and this is provided by our government. They fund this research where the researchers come together and produce documents that can be a tremendous resource as a teacher leader. I strongly recommend you look into them if you haven't already. I know many of you have likely heard about these already. So I just wanted to lift this up, that they are out there for your use for free, because it's tax-based. Our federal government is providing the What Works Clearinghouse and this IES documents. Also, they're trusted distillations. Perhaps you've heard of the National Reading Council, and certainly in the National Reading Panel. Now, I know that was in like 2000, so it's been a while, but that research is seminal, and it really lays a foundation of what we're talking about today with best practices, the best science, what we know about how to teach students to learn how to read. So if you have any questions about that, reach out to us, but I would encourage you to look into those, and you might even consider using it as like a resource for a PLC or a grade level conversation. And when I work with leaders across the country, and they always ask me, all right, Dr. Praska, what can I do for my teachers to help them move forward? They want to know, when I go in and observe a classroom, and when I talk about observations today, I'm not talking about evaluative observations. I'm talking about instructional guidance observations. As a leader, what are you doing to support instruction in your schools? And if you are a teacher, then you know, you can think, well, what do I need to best support my students? So these are those look fors. What should you look for? What should you listen for? So that you know that your instruction is based on science. So thinking about the cognitive foundations and simple view of reading, the decoding side or the word recognition side, it's focusing on sounds within words. That's the very most discrete skill. Letter sounds, identifying that, and then moving it into sounds within words, isolating them, breaking them apart, putting that back together, connecting letters and patterns and a scope and sequence of how this is very discreetly and specifically taught is very important. I would encourage you as a teacher or as a teacher leader to do an audit of your curriculum and your resources. Do you have a scope and sequence available? This is very important. This is a place to start, because we want to move to that sequential instruction and not haphazard instruction. And what I mean by that is, if a student comes in and the data is indicating that they are working on still isolating letters and sounds, that you're following a scope and sequence and not jumping around from pattern to pattern. And so just Google a scope and sequence, look into your curriculum, but do make sure that you have that there so that you can point to where your instruction is and how it's meeting the needs of a particular group of students in a sequential, explicit manner. And then also providing opportunities for students to connect the learning of that code learning, whatever specific discrete skill they're working on, to text. Now you might think of that, probably what you've heard of it is a decodable text, where students are instructed the code, whatever code they're reading. It might be CVC words, it might be vowel teams, whatever that is, that they then have an opportunity to practice that in a connected text. They're working on that phonics pattern, and they're having opportunities to read in connected text that pattern, which is a little bit different than perhaps using level text or predictable text, where the pattern isn't often and is not repeated enough to support that learning. So take a moment after this webinar and look at your resources. Do you have the scope and sequence, and do you have text that helps the students practice the phonics patterns that they're taught? So now switching over to the language comprehension side. If a student is still working on the decoding side, we still want them to have access to grade level text. This is really important. That's where that language and vocabulary acquisition comes into play. So what you're doing as a teacher is you are lifting up rich, complex text, interactive read alouds. There's scaffolding support. If a student's not able to read independently, you are scaffolding support so they have access to that grade level text. Now, this is different than perhaps some of you have heard about using level text, where a student was only allowed access to text at their level. We know now that students must be provided an opportunity to access grade level complex text, and that might require scaffolding. So what that might mean is you are helping them work with a partner read, a repeat read of text that you have read aloud, and you are reading aloud to them with this interactive reading. Is teacher student in a supported peer-to-peer, and they're talking about what they read. You're lifting up that vocabulary. And so that students have an opportunity to share knowledge and the vocabulary. So it doesn't mean sit and listen. It's an active, engaged process where students are interacting with the teacher and interacting with each other as they're building that robust vocabulary knowledge that's going to lift up the language comprehension piece of the simple view of reading. So really what we want to know is, what are we doing with students? Is it working? We're here today because we want our students to learn to read. We want them to comprehend text. We don't want them to read 5 pages of a physics book and be like, well, what did I just read? That was a waste of time. So how do we know what we're implementing? Is it working? We know that all students come to us with a different context. So we're going to have to support students at their level. Where are they coming? Are they still working on letter sound association? Have they moved to vowel teams, or have they moved on to multisyllabic words? Teaching is an art. I want to honor where all of you are today. You are the experts of your students. This is not easy. And it's important to know that to honor what you do is hard, and it impacts students every day. So it is an art. And it's important as you move forward then to know, is what I'm doing working? If it's not working, we need to change. Now, speaking to the leaders, thinking about this as systems. The teachers are really important, and their job is very difficult, as is leader. Being a school leader is a difficult, challenging task. Does the system allow for change to occur when instructional change is necessary based on data? So think about that. Do you have opportunities for collaboration and looking at data? Data-based decision making is doing the science of reading. It's not checking boxes to say you've done something. It's looking at the data and having a system that allows instruction to meet the needs of students. And that is a process change, and sometimes a systems change. So leaders and teachers work together and support each other through the process. That's the doing of science of reading. So you heard me say that we want to know if it's working. And how do we determine if something is working? Well, that's where progress monitoring comes into place. So we know that they're given the opportunity to have an assessment 3 times a year. That's your grade level, kind of your general outcome measure. Like, is a student at grade level? Are they where we want them to be? And if they're not, we need to dig a little bit deeper. And that's where map reading fluency comes into place then. So you have your map reading growth, and you have your map reading fluency. Within map reading fluency, you have the opportunity to progress monitor. Perhaps you're progress monitoring and providing an intervention for a student on oral reading fluency. Or perhaps they're still working on foundational skills. So you're progress monitoring on phonics or word recognition, or within logical awareness. The importance here is that you're monitoring progress to move the needle for that student up. And we want to set ambitious goals. For students that are at grade level or above grade level, a year's worth of growth is great. They are going to continue to move up their skills and advance. If a student is receiving an intervention and they are below grade level, they need more than a year's worth of growth. So that progress monitoring is really important, extremely important, to make sure that they are closing the gap. If those students make a year's worth of growth, that's fabulous, but they won't close that gap. So you want to establish goals that move towards closing the gap and moving the student towards grade level comprehension of text and grade level foundational skills. You can go to the next slide, and I can, this graphic demonstrates it just a little bit better. Now this student trend line is perfect. The green bubbles demonstrate the map growth, and the orange bubbles are the map reading fluency. Then the little orange circles in between are the progress monitoring. And this student, we can see that what we're doing is working, because those more discrete skills, the very small bubbles of progress monitoring, indicate that yes, it's working. The student's trend line is moving up. Let's just say the trend line was not moving up. That's where you pause and say, is what we're doing working? And also note, the importance for progress monitoring is it's more granular. Sometimes we don't see progress at the big outcome measure that's given 3 times a year, but we might see progress at the more granular level. So we don't want to give up too soon. And that's the importance of progress monitoring, is it lets you know if something's working or not. You can adjust it, and then eventually you also want to see the growth in the more general outcome measures as your universal 3 times a year map growth and map reading fluency. So putting that all together, that is a lot to take in. And I want to just pause and let you look at that and think about your process for analyzing data in your school. Do you have a system that allows that provides an opportunity for teachers to not only collect the data, but analyze the data? So Luke, I've described this science of reading target a bit and how it fits into different aspects of data. Would you like to talk to us about, well, now what? How do we get there?
Absolutely. Thank you, Beth. I think in many of the conversations I have with district leaders or school leaders, whether that's at the Fusion Conference a couple of weeks ago or the Alaska Science of Reading Symposium, folks are asking, okay, I understand why literacy. I understand a little bit about what the science is. I understand that's the body of research. It's not a movement. It's not a sticker that we're slapping on a piece of instructional materials. It's actually the evidence. But what do we do now? And so one of the things that I want to acknowledge is that this is very hard work. And so in my personal work to change the collective story we tell about literacy, one of the questions I keep asking is, how do I honor the experience, knowledge, and skills of those doing the work, teachers in the classroom? How do I make it very clear that we're only empowering and enhancing teacher knowledge? Because I do not think we need to abandon everything we know about what works and what matters within literacy instruction to bring the science of reading to life. What's most important to me, that we're here today having this conversation. We're examining the stories that our students can tell about their experience learning to read, and that we are moving from advocacy to action by changing one problematic instructional practice at a time. And so as we think about these stories that we want our students to tell about their experience learning to read, we have to think about our own storylines as literacy leaders. How do we show up as a character supporting our teachers? What's the climax of reading instruction in our school? And how do we find balance within some of these central conflicts in our story? So one of the things I want us to be clear about today in our focus in supporting teachers with the science of reading, it's much less about balancing literacy and more about balancing priorities. This again is how the science of reading can be a heavy load to bear if we go about it alone. So before I joined NWEA in my district, you may have heard it in my voice, I'm from East Tennessee, we were working really hard to implement new curricula, shifting problematic instructional practice, invest in professional learning. We had been on a targeted supports and intervention list by the state, and all of this was happening amidst a pandemic. Anyone else out there sound familiar or your last few years? And so as we think about where to begin and how to find balance, we're taking a moment to acknowledge the tough demands that actually are facing our teachers in our schools today. Kelly Moran, she's the director of instructional programs for Educational Service Center of the Western Reserve. She recently challenged literacy leaders to adopt an improvement mindset, to consider what your impact as a literacy leader might look like if you positioned yourself as a coach who motivates, trains, counsels, shepherds your athlete teachers in best practices for developing skilled readers. Just as players come to the game prepared with the proper footwear, rest, and hydration, coaches come prepared with their knowledge, encouragement, and arguably most important, their playbook. Now, what's in your playbook? A few components of her improvement mindset, they really stood out to me. Focus on the fundamentals, celebrate small victories, and get in the game. So supporting teachers with the science of reading is a call to focus on the fundamentals. Let's get very clear on how we teach reading. What's our approach? And as you help your teachers shift instruction, there may be moments of challenge and discomfort. We must celebrate those small wins along the way as we adopt this know better, do better mindset. And ultimately, improving reading outcomes for our students is not a spectator sport. Leaders must get in the game, they must know the facts, and they must run alongside their team. So I want you to take a moment to think about what might be your playbook for literacy and what do you need to include. Let's talk about those 5 improvement essentials as we consider where do we go from here. And so one of the things that we know from the University of Chicago and their 5 essentials, there's a framework for school improvement that focuses on 5 key areas. We know that we need ambitious instruction, collaborative teachers, effective leaders, involved families, and supportive environments. Okay, that's nothing new on this call. But what we know is that at NWEA, we support schools in gathering reliable evidence about these indicators as the foundation for all improvement initiatives. And so in the same way as literacy leaders, we can think about the challenge ahead using this formula. So we know effective leaders have a clear vision for literacy and we rally others around that vision. So that vision might articulate what's the portrait of a reader or the portrait of a writer that clearly shares how your school, district, or state supports students, teachers, and communities for literacy. In addition, we need collaborative teachers who plan together to implement what works and what matters in literacy instruction. And as leaders, we need to partner in that work by learning alongside our teachers, understanding their needs, sharing evidence-based practices, and cultivating engaging resources for teaching aligned with the science of reading. Now, when we think about involved families, they're an essential component to a comprehensive approach because we can use a blog series designed for parents, such as the one we've made available through our ebooks, to ignite that conversation about how families can support reading at home. What can they do? Beyond sending home word lists to be memorized, like in my experience, there are actionable steps from the science that teachers can share with their parents to support and really grow another layer of advocates for high quality literacy instruction. As we think about environment, we cannot neglect that essential component. Teachers and students need access to supportive environments that go beyond aligned policies and practices to include what are the products and tools that support developing readers. As Beth mentioned, we need to know our materials and we need to know whether they're working or whether they're not working. And so as leaders, we must ask ourselves, do our initiatives match our investments? Does every teacher have access to the tools that they need to be successful in this shift with the science of reading? And ultimately, as we think about ambitious instruction, that must become the standard for teaching and learning in our school. Are students challenged and inspired to reach their full potential as fluent readers and effective writers? We must think about how can we showcase that work happening across our schools, districts, and states, because we want to honor what is happening in our classrooms as we're growing together. So whether you think about your improvement strategy as a game plan and you're writing your playbook, or you think about it as a recipe and you're gathering the ingredients, these essentials help us know where to focus and where to spend our time. And so as we think about focus, one of the things that I like to bring in is a little bit of improvement science. Dr. Burke, a noted improvement scientist, said it best: implement fast, learn slow, and burn goodwill as you go. That's what we want to avoid. And so I think we all want to avoid this because that's a recipe for disaster. How many times have we jumped in with a new initiative, but we've not taken anything off the table? We're giving one more thing to teachers when their plate's already full. And so as we think about this, we need to think about how often are we engaging in de-implementation? Are we taking time to learn from the changes that are happening around us in teaching and learning? And do we have a good pulse on the state of the teachers carrying out the work in our schools? In the same way that teacher clarity is one of the most essential levers in student learning, I would also argue that leader clarity is one of those most essential levers for teacher learning. So when we put something on the table, such as a new initiative with the science of reading, we must be prepared to take something off. We must be prepared to go slow so we can go far. One of the things we also know, in addition to focus, these shifts take time. Joyce and Showers noted that to build the highest level of skill, teachers need hours to study theory, opportunities to engage in demonstration lessons, and the freedom to practice in safe, supportive environments. This national story about literacy outcomes, it's decades in the making, and it's going to take a significant amount of effort and energy to write a new story. And so are you crafting your literacy improvement strategy to survive beyond the next adoption cycle or beyond the next strategic plan? Now, one of the things I want to do before I hand it back over to Beth for a second, I want to make sure that we pause and reflect. I don't want you leaving this webinar today saying it's just gloom and doom, it's a bunch of bad news, because that's just not true. When we think about our students, our schools, and our future, there's only good news from here on out. Here's 3 headlines to hold on to. For students, when we learn to read, we can learn to love reading. No one approach to teaching reading has a monopoly on joy. For schools, teachers bring the science of reading to life. It's not about the products or tools, rather it's about the people and who are in our buildings doing the work. And when we think about our future, we can change the stories our students tell about learning to read. What do you want your students to say about their experience learning to read? So one of the things as we think about this next chapter in our story, Dr. Louisa Moats provides this encouragement. This we know: reading failure can be prevented in all but a small percentage of children with serious learning disorders. It's possible to teach most students to learn how to read if we start early, follow the significant body of research which practices are identified as most effective. And then we know that researchers estimate that 95% of kids can be taught to read by the end of 1st grade. So if reading failure is prevented, let's hear from Beth again about how we can partner together to help all kids learn.
Thank you, Luke. And I do like to reiterate the partnering part. We're here today as your partner. NWEA wants to partner with you, as Luke said earlier, to lighten the load. This is hard work. If you're a leader or if you're a teacher supporting students in any way, we want to help you lighten the load. So that moves us into then, well, let's look at some data that you collect. You collect a lot of data. Now it's time to look at the data and help that with your instruction. And NWEA wants to lighten that load. You see here a report, and it shows where students are at and what they're ready to learn. So by connecting students' data to what to do with it is going to help you lighten that load. So in Map Reading Fluency, this shows the instructional planning report. So I would encourage you to, after you collect the data, to pull up this report. I've already mentioned that students follow that progression of skills. For phonics, letter sound, and then moving into CVC words, and then vowel teams. So looking at this report, it's going to let you know what is the student ready to learn. This is their zone of proximal development. So you see here that we have different groups of students, and this instructional report then lightens the load because you now know what to help, where to start instruction. Whether it be on the left, you see some students that would start the instruction with letters and sounds, and then moving over to letters and words, and then decodable CVC, and so on. And to help make it even easier, we provide some instructional guidance, some opportunities to look below and click on a link that brings you right to instruction that will meet that specific granular instructional aspect within phonics word recognition. And that is what we want to do. We want to lighten the load. I've been there. You can spend hours and hours and hours planning because we all have the passion to move our students forward. And I want to encourage you then to look at this report, to lighten that load and provide instruction that's going to meet the needs of your students. Because it's certainly not going to benefit, as I talked about those building blocks and that foundation. If the student's ready to work on decodable words, CVC words, and you're instructing them in letters and sounds, that's not appropriate. Same thing, if the students are working on letters and sounds and we're working on one syllable words, that's not going to provide that foundation that we're looking for. So I encourage you to use this tool, use this report to help drive your instruction. So looking at that, then putting this together is this early literacy solution. We want the data to be actionable to support students in their reading journey, which it supports the teachers, and then you support the students. And if you're a leader, how can you support this system? Do teachers have an opportunity to get together and dig into this data and then plan using the resources that we've provided? So assessment data and research is based in research. NWEA uses research to put this together, and we are bringing this to light for you today to help guide you towards the instruction that does fall within the science of reading. I've been talking about thriving within this greater ecosystem in the instruction, including professional learning. We've talked about that today. Like, as a leader, do you have an opportunity to move teachers forward with adequate professional learning that they need based on where your students are at? And coaching, instructional coaching is so important. As you're not going in to evaluate, you're going into a support instruction. And then time to evaluate the data, that data consultation, like meeting peer-to-peer, teacher to teacher, teacher with a reading coach, teacher with an administrator. Whatever your system is, do you have opportunities to support each other? Because then it supports the students. So the broader NWEA early learning literacy solution is about how we can help schools. I said, I want to partner. We're here to partner with you. So how can we help you replicate some really great best practices in your school? And I've done this with other schools. I partner with schools all over the country and work with leaders, and then they work with the teachers to replicate instruction based on science that's going to move students forward. So think about, as you have an opportunity to reflect on everything that we've shared today, it's a lot of information coming. Know that we're here to partner with you so you can replicate what is working in schools and bringing the pieces together to make a difference, because we want all students on track to read well by third grade and read well their whole life and make meaning, so that they don't have to read 5 pages in a text and not understand what it's about. So I'm going to turn it back to Luke and talk more about some of the pieces of that broader early literacy solution.
So as we get into this last few minutes, I do want to encourage you, if you have questions that are coming up, please use that Q&A box because we are going to save some time at the end. And as those questions are coming in, I want to give you a snapshot about one of the ways that we partner, because I'll be very honest, I'll be very transparent. Professional learning, I think, is one of those key levers that supports teachers beyond the adoption cycle, beyond the strategic plan, and investment in our teachers. That really is one of the things that can push our schools and district forward. One of the things that we want to avoid is a research poor context, because we want to make sure teachers have access to that research, because data is good. But for changing instruction, data connected to research-based practice is better. And so leaders, we have a responsibility to provide teachers with content-focused professional learning that develops their professional knowledge. So because while there is significant agreement on these essentials, the body of evidence continues to grow. The science never stops. And so I want to just give a preview of what this looks like for us. So for example, one of the practical components of our professional learning, Beth showed the example of the instructional planning report. One of the things I noticed is that it was focused on phonics and word recognition. So I can imagine there's a leader on this call. You've heard snippets from the Soul to Story podcast or highlights from a recent webinar calling for better phonics instruction. You may have reviewed the data from tools like Map Reading Fluency, and you've noticed a pattern. You've scheduled an essential reports training or some kind of supplemental training to support your teachers in understanding the results that you're seeing. But beyond that, we need to support teachers with the connections between the theory, between the practice, and between the tools. And so as you think about this particular work, one of the questions that we ask, how can we teach hard words in ways that make them stick? How do we choose and use text purposefully? And how do we design and deliver phonics lessons? So what's exciting to me is that we go beyond the theory and we dive in with demonstration, micro teaching, and planning cycles. And I want to make sure that you have some takeaways. One of the things that I want to avoid in our time today is that you feel like, well, that's great, but I'm not leaving with anything. One of the things I want you to know is that the things I'm demonstrating now on the slides, they will be available in the follow-up email. So for teachers, along with our professional learning, we provide an aligned lesson planning tool that helps us get to something that I think is really important, efficiency. So we provide a 20-minute instructional routine that provides students with regular exposure and practice to opportunities that highlight those regular and irregular grapheme-phoneme relationships. In addition, for leaders, we have an aligned learning walk tool because we want to make sure, in the same way that Beth was talking, that we're providing that educative support, going alongside our teachers and saying, hey, I know you're making this shift and I want to support you. Here's one of the ways that we do that with this learning walk tool. We help them understand what's the trends we're seeing in individual classrooms and across our school context. In the same way, we go beyond and we want to support students. And so one hurdle for young students who are beginning to read is learning those letter names, shapes, and sounds. And so to help students master those arbitrary patterns, we have found in research that letter-embedded mnemonics are more effective than using regular letters on their own or letters accompanied by a picture. So we've commissioned a complete set of embedded mnemonics to share as a part of our professional learning series on early word recognition. And so when we think about what we have available, we don't just offer our product work, we also offer our product independent work to really enhance, like I said, empower and enhance teacher content knowledge. And so when I think about what's next for leaders, we want you to be able to tell your story, to align your strategy, and focus on learning. Those are 3 steps that any teacher or school leader may take. When I was talking with folks at Fusion last week, 2 weeks ago, they were asking, where do we begin? It's hard because there's so many polarities. It's getting so political in my state. There's a few things that we can do. And once again, I don't want to leave you without something as far as a takeaway. And so a way you can tell your story, everything you need to know about the science of reading. Our ebook is an accessible introduction that you can use as a foundation for a strong PLC or leadership team conversations. As you think about aligning your strategy, including your community and of parents, we have an ebook ready to share with parents. What's a guide for families on how to support this work at home? And in the same way as we're focusing on learning, we want to make sure to give teachers access to some strategies to level up. And so you might consider sharing our article, 6 Ways to Level Up with the Science of Reading. And once again, all of these will be available in our post-webinar email. And so thank you all for engaging with us today. I'm going to stop sharing as we take a few moments here to answer a couple of questions.
Well, so far, the only question, it's not really a question, is someone's reaching out from Thief River Falls, Minnesota. Shout out to northern Minnesota. If you ever get to Minnesota, please go up north. You will know why I'm saying that once you get there. So I want to open up the floor. If anybody has questions, please post them in the Q&A.
You know, one of the things that often come up is we're stuck. We have these materials today. We just purchased these things and I can't, we spent millions of dollars on this contract. What do I do? One of the things that you might consider is evaluating within those materials what works and where might you need to supplement. Calling on your teacher expertise and giving them a voice into how you make these shifts. I think that's a great way to involve your teachers in this comprehensive literacy strategy. You know, folks are also asking, what do we do about the politics? You know, and so, like I said, you may be leading through polarities, responding to mandates in your particular state. One of the things that we know is that we can be very simple with this, as Beth talked about the simple view of reading. When we focus on a few discrete instructional practices that we want to improve, that may be the best way to begin instead of trying to take on the whole thing. Question just came in about how do we get the materials. And so one of the things that our host here, NCEA, will be sending out, they'll be sending out all of these links through the post-webinar email blast. And also I will say that if some reason one of the the links do not come through. All of the things that we've shown on the screen today are available directly on the NWEA website. Let's see, a question that's coming in about what trainings do we have free to teach with Science of Reading or with OG? One of the things that I would say is that we do offer, in addition to some of our on-demand content, we do offer additional webinar series like this one through our NWEA program. And so always be sure to check that out. And one of my favorites is our Teach, Learn, Grow blog series that's always available for ongoing learning.
Let's lift up that. How do we get through to those longtime teachers who just want to teach the way they want? I understand that. Change is hard. So let's look at data. Are we comfortable with half of our students learning to read competently and half of our students not? Let's pray on that. Let's think about, is this where we want to be? Because I would hope and pray that they're not in teaching to not teach all students how to read. So let the data do the talking and then break down the simple view of reading within those building blocks. It's overwhelming to change when you think you have to change the whole system. So I would encourage a leader to break down the process with teachers and walk alongside them as a support mechanism to change the system, not as an evaluative method, but as a support system. Use the cognitive foundation research and other research similar to it to help them break down the code of how to teach reading step by step, instead of overwhelming with, oh my gosh, half of our students aren't reading, we're doing it wrong, we need to make a change. Just like we progress monitor students on discrete measures, we progress monitor our teachers on discrete measures and help them build a foundation of instruction that lifts students up.
And I want to add to that. I think it's very easy for us on this call and in our schools to say, yes, we believe all students can learn to read. That's an easy statement. I don't think you would ask any teacher, they would not disagree with that. The next layer of questioning we can ask as leaders is, does our teaching reflect that belief? Does our teaching reflect the belief that all students can read? Are we giving all students access to those equitable and excellent opportunities for literacy instruction? One of the questions that just come in that I really want Beth to think about here is about what's the intersection of map reading fluency and map growth? How do we work on implementation and training? So Beth, could you take us a little bit through that?
I sure can. And I hear you, the person that left this comment. We don't want to over assess our students, but especially in those foundational skill years, it is important to have data that supports instruction of, like, how do we know what to instruct? Map growth is going to let us know our students comprehending at grade level, because that's where we want to be. But sometimes we have to dig a little bit deeper, and within those foundational skills, are they able to decode? Are they able to understand the sounds and letter correlation? So that's where reading fluency, map reading fluency comes into play. Because yes, we want to have the map growth understanding, are they comprehending? But in those foundational skill years, so K2, we want to dig deeper and look at those foundational skills. And also when students are moving on to connected text, are they reading accurately and fluently at the appropriate rate? So that's why I think they do intersect. They both play a different role, and they're both extremely important, because if it's falling apart with the comprehension, we need to know, well, what's going on under the hood? Where's the gap? What blocks in that cognitive foundation are not there, so their tower is falling over like the Jenga game?
And in terms of the training, I know we're running out of time here. If you have any other questions, please send those to us by email, and we'll be happy to get back with you. But in terms of the training, your partners at NWEA will work with you to get that just-in-time training, right? As when you're ready to launch, we'll make sure you're ready to deliver, and then after that, make sure you're ready to understand the reports, and then what's next instructionally. So I know we've got still more questions that we didn't get to today. Please feel free to reach out to us by email. And then I want to turn it back over to our host to close us out. Thank you all today.
Thank you both for your presentation today. It was great to listen in and to get to see all of the great content that you're sharing with our teachers. Thank you everyone else for attending today's webinar. NCEA continuously strives to improve the quality of our services for our members based on feedback. We will use your input to inform future work and improve services. So I've dropped a survey in the chat. If you could complete that, that would be wonderful. You will also receive a certificate of attendance. So please be sure to include your email when you're completing that at the end of the survey. It's an automatic email that comes out. So if you have any issues, feel free to reach out to me or to any of our NCEA representatives to help you with that. I will make sure that my email is in the show notes, as well as our lovely panelists today as well. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Beth.
Thank you all for having us.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Have a great day, everyone.